software process model is a simplified representation of a software process. Each process model represents a process from a particular perspective, and thus it may provide only partial information about that process. For example, a process activity model shows the activities and their sequence, but may not actually show the roles of people involved in these activities. So in this introductory part of this lecture video, we will very generally talk about process models. The only ones we talk about are the waterfall model, the incremental model, and the spiral model. The waterfall model. This takes the fundamental process activities which we have defined in the previous video. The activities include specification, development, validation, and evolution, and represents them as a separate process phase, such as requirement specification, software design, implementation, testing, and so on. The second generic model, what we are going to talk about, is the incremental development model. So this model interleaves these activities of specification, development, and validation. The system is developed as a series of versions or increments, with each version adding more functionality to the previous one. The third model, the spiral model. This is a model which performs a little bit of risk analysis or takes risk analysis and overcoming or dealing with risk as high priority. In this lecture video, however, we are going to take up just the first model, that is the waterfall model, in detail. So let's get started. The waterfall model is illustrated on the slide here. As you can see, the waterfall model defines 5 stages of process or 5 process activities. The first one is the requirements definition. The second one is system and software design. The third one is implementation and unit testing. The next one is integration and system testing. And the last one is operation and maintenance. If you carefully observe, you can map these activities to the process activities which we have defined in the previous lecture video. Because of the cascade you can see from one phase to the other, this model is called as the waterfall model or the software life cycle model. The waterfall model is an example of a plan-driven process. That is, you must definitely plan thoroughly and schedule all of the process activities even before you start working on them. Because once you sign off an activity, there is no way you can go back to it. If you carefully observe, once your requirements definition is done, there is an arrow pointing to the next phase. You can see this. Once this is done, arrow pointing to the next phase. There is no arrow pointing back to the previous phase. That's why it's called as the waterfall model, because it's just cascading. The phases cascade or fall from one phase to the other. There is absolutely no feedback. So thorough planning is crucial whenever you apply the waterfall model for development. So let's talk about the principal stages of this model. The first stage, requirements analysis and definition. The system services, the constraints, the goals are established in consultation with the customer or the system user. They are then defined in detail, and this detailing serves as the system specification. This is the first phase of the waterfall model. Let's go to the next phase, system and software design. The system's design process allocates the requirements to either hardware or software systems by establishing an overall system architecture. Software design involves identifying and describing the fundamental software system abstractions and their relationships. This is the second phase of the waterfall model. Let's move on to the third phase, implementation and unit testing. During this stage, the software design is realized as a set of programs or program units. Unit testing involves verifying that each unit or each program unit meets its specification. The next phase, integration and system testing. The individual program units or programs that were developed and tested in the previous phase are now integrated and tested as a complete system to ensure that the software requirements have been met. After testing, the software system is delivered to the customer. The last phase, operation and maintenance. Normally, this is the longest life cycles phase. The system is installed here, it's put into field or practical use, and maintenance involves correcting errors which were not discovered in the earlier stages of the life cycle, improving the implementation of your system units, enhancing the system services, adding new requirements, implementing and integrating them into the existing system all make up the operation and maintenance phase. So now that we know the different phases and what happens in each phase of the waterfall model, let us look at a little bit of detailing. So what are the principal attributes of the waterfall model? In principle, the result of each phase is one or more documents that are approved or signed off. The following phase should not start until the previous phase has finished and is approved. Let's look at the practical scenario. In practice, there is some kind of overlap and feed information between these stages. During design, problems with requirements may be identified. During coding, design problems may be found, and so on. So in practice, the software process is definitely not a simple linear model as depicted in the waterfall model, but it definitely involves certain amount of feedback from one phase to the other, which is not facilitated in the waterfall model. Documents produced in each phase may then have to be modified to reflect the changes made. But this is not so flexible with the waterfall model. Let's look at some of the limitations of the waterfall model. Because of the costs of producing and approving documents, because you have to be very thorough at each phase, iterations become costly and involve significant rework. Therefore, after a small number of iterations of every phase, when we say iterations, I mean iterations of each phase, because once you sign off the phase, there is no way you're going to go back to that phase. So the same phase will be iterated, revised again and again, just to make sure before you sign off and move to the next phase. So it is impractical to test a phase continuously, for many iterations, because that's going to involve a lot of rework and it's going to be costly. Therefore, it's a common practice that after a small number of iterations, you have to freeze that part of the phase or that phase of the process activity. Problems, if at all, are encountered, are left for later resolution or ignored or programmed around. This premature freezing of requirements may mean that the system won't do exactly what the customer wants. During the final life cycle phase, that is operation and maintenance, the software is actually put into use. Errors and omissions in the original software requirements are now discovered. Program and design errors emerge, and there is a need for new functionality that has to be integrated into the existing system. So the system should definitely evolve in order to remain useful, otherwise it gets outdated. Making these software changes or even adding hardware components may involve repeating all the previous process stages. So the major problem of the waterfall model is inflexible partitioning of project into distinct stages, as we saw in the previous diagram. Commitments must be made at an early stage, which makes it difficult to respond to changing customer requirements, because there is no way you can reiterate a previous phase or provide feedback to the previous phase. So where should we use the waterfall model? In principle, the waterfall model should be used only when the requirements are well understood and are unlikely to change radically during the system's development phases. So this is the waterfall model. Simple and easy to implement, the major drawback being no feedback between phases of development, which is actually the need of a practical scenario. This is basically because customers, when they come to you with requirements, are not 100% sure of what they need. The requirements keep changing, and with waterfall model in place, there is the principal need of the waterfall model or requirement of the waterfall model is that your requirement should be concrete and well understood, which is definitely not the case in a practical scenario. So this is the waterfall model for you. Thank you.